Hi, I believe it's time to begin. My name is Catherine Rice. I'm VTOA's president, and I have the privilege of moderating today's VTOA webinar on telecommunications in the Trump era. We could not be doing this webinar today without the help of Tanya Rideout, the Deputy Director for our very supportive parent association, the National Association of Telecommunication Officers and Advisors, NATOA. Every month, NATOA holds webinars just like these on a wide variety of cable franchising, broadband, and PEG topics of national and local interest. And we encourage everyone on this call, this conference call, to check out the natoa.org website. So the title of today's webinar is Telecommunications in the Trump Era, Impacts of the Election. The session is scheduled to last for about an hour. I'll introduce our speaker, Jerry Lederer, who will take about 30 minutes to share his insights with us, and then we'll take questions from you, the audience. And to you, the audience, please type your question into the box on the side of the screen, on the right side of the screen, and we will field those questions as soon as we can. You should know that anyone who has registered for this webinar will get an archived version of it after the session in case you miss part of the discussion. So, as I mentioned, today our speaker is Jerry Lederer, who many of you know as Jerry. Jerry's background as both a nationally recognized telecommunication lawyer and a registered federal lobbyist allows him to give clients invaluable service in a field built on complex and technical regulations. Jerry is a partner at Best & Krieger, LLP, and he serves as legislative counsel and lead Washington advocate for the city of Laredo, Texas, and for Telecommunity, a collection of local governments dedicated to ensuring respect for local rights in the federal legislative activity. Prior to joining BB&K, many of us knew Jerry as an attorney with Miller Van Eaton, another highly regarded telecommunication law firm in DC. Jerry advocates for public and private property owners regarding issues of law and policy arising from federal and state communication legislation and regulation. He is known as one of the nation's leading authorities on marketplace solutions for the integration of technology into commercial real estate. He developed the first model license agreement for access to buildings and rooftops to help telecommunications service providers and property owners protect their interests. So Jerry has also served as an executive director of advocacy and research advancement for the Building Owners and Managers Association International, and as the executive director of government affairs for United States Telephone Association, for those who you remember that. Prior to arriving in DC in 1985, as the City of Philadelphia's Washington advocate, Jerry served as the Chief Deputy City Commissioner for the City of Philadelphia, and since 1985 he served as the Washington Legislative Counsel to a number of local governments and agencies, including as lead advocate for local governments on infrastructure issues and as General Counsel for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Jerry is also a member of the Federal Communication Bar Association and is admitted to practice law in the state of New Jersey and in the District of Columbia. His education includes a JD from Temple University School of Law and a BA from Harvard College. Jerry also was the recipient of NATOA's 2011 Member of the Year Award. No small accolade. And so with that, Jerry, we've asked you to address a very tough topic on the impact of the election and where you think what you think telecommunications might look like in the President Trump era. The virtual floor is now yours.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you for your best attempts at the New Jersey accent and for your pronunciation of my college. Could we go to the next slide, please? So, look, an awful lot of what we're going to do is speculation for the next 25 minutes. If I could, I'd like to run a commercial for NATOA and VTOA and why you need to be a member of both. This is the agenda for local government at the FCC and for just the next quarter. And if it's not for the leadership of Steve Traylor and NATOA, as well as the other national organizations, but it was really Steve that carried the ball, we would have a lot uglier calendar. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that today And on the 19th, there are 2 new broadband rules that go into effect for your local housing. And if you're not aware of that, please look it up and make sure that your housing people are aware. The consolidated plan is the plan that you have to file with HUD so that you can get CDBG and lots of other housing funds. And going forward, you need to demonstrate in your HUD plan how you're going to bring broadband, or how broadband is proximate to your HUD investment properties. Also, starting on Thursday, for any new construction that you do or any major renovation that you do, you're going to have to ensure that any properties that have 4 or more units have broadband broadband capabilities, whether it be wired or wireless, in those properties. So again, we have a paper out on that. I'm more than happy to share that with anybody. My contact information will be at the end. So, you know, again, it's broadband in the Trump administration, but there's a number of holdovers from the Obama administration, and you know, we haven't seen an effort to overturn any of those yet. President gets sworn in on Friday. On the 31st, we'll see the first meeting of the GOP under the new control, and we'll talk about what the new FCC might look like, and who that leadership might be, and we will talk about it in light of the news out there today, that we may be reorganizing, or they may be reorganizing the way the FCC is structured, including the bureaus. I did want to point out that there's an important filing, and I hope that everyone will do it on February the 9th. As folks remember, the way that the rules work with respect to closed captioning is that most local government, if not all local government channels, PEG channels in general, are exempt from closed captioning because of, one, our budget, or there are a number of other exemptions that we qualify for. What the FCC is requiring people to do today, however, is to register with the Commission, and in registering, to verify that you're entitled, in fact, to the exemption. ACM pointed out to the FCC that the way they wrote their broad requirement for registration and certification from exemption, it was not just the channels that needed to file, but in fact it was individual programmers. And so what ACM has done is they filed a petition asking them to exempt individual programmers and limit it to actual commenters. I'm sorry, actual channels. I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback. So can I ask people to go on mute? Catherine, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, and I'll go on mute, Jerry. You're coming in fine.
Okay. So February 9th and February 24th are the comments and the reply comments. And so the question is, you know, how will telecommunications be treated in the Trump era? Well, here we're going to have an opening salvo to figure out right then and there. This is a reasonable exemption, and if we're active, I think that there's a good chance that it'll happen. And March 8th is the real biggie, though. That's the mobility due date for the comments, and again, it's March the 8th as opposed to February the 8th, thanks to the leadership of Steve Traylor and Natel in getting us that extra month. Mobility has filed a petition with the FCC, and we'll talk about it in greater detail, that really asks the FCC to provide a new regime for oversight of our rights-of-way for purposes of the deployment of mobile communications, wireless devices, and it's a real threat, and we need to figure that out, and we need to comment to show, one, that it's not needed, two, that it's illegal, that is, it's not permitted under the Communications Act, and then finally it's not permitted under the Constitution because it would be a taking. But we'll spend more time in looking at that. So again, we're going to do a lot of speculating from now on, but I wanted to make sure that everyone had this calendar in front of them so that they knew that it's imperative that Vatella join their brothers and sister communities across the country in being active in these various proceedings. Next slide, please, Catherine.
Trying, Jerry. It's not moving.
Well, that's okay.
There we go.
Thanks.
There we go. We're all
right.
slow today, I guess.
So if we take a peek, the program is not just the Trump era, but it's the 115th Congress. And what I think we have coming right up front is net neutrality and a Telecommunications Act, TCA, Telecommunications Act, Communications Act rewrite. I think we're going to see both of those right out of the chute. The real question is whether or not we will see a rewrite, holistic rewrite, or will we see a targeted effort to overturn net neutrality? And we keep hearing different things. The FCC, some of the leadership in the FCC says we're going to wait and take our lead from the Congress. We see some of the congressional staff saying, you know what, we're going to see what the FCC can accomplish on their own rather than moving it in legislation. I don't think we will know. I think if there's one hint that we have, it's that the new leader of the telecom subcommittee, that is Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, she so hates net neutrality that I would be surprised if she did not start hearings and try to move, again, a rifle shot approach to overturning net neutrality. That would basically probably be an overturn of the Commission's finding that broadband has a Title II or a common carrier component. And I think we'll see something like that move rather quickly. I don't think that gets through the Senate nearly as quickly. And so I think any net neutrality relief is going to happen in the FCC, but it's just too attractive an issue for many people in the House to leave alone. I also think that we're going to see a tax reform review across the board in Congress, and in that will be the harmonizing of how we tax transactions, whether they be at a brick and mortar store or whether they take place online. And so some of the things that we saw in the past, there's the Wireless Tax Fairness Act that imposes a 5-year moratorium. I don't know if we see that again, but it probably will be introduced. I do think that we'll see an online sales tax, and I believe that we'll see the Mobile Now Act. Next slide, please. Again, continuing on the theme of harmonizing taxation between what happens online versus what happens at bricks and mortar, there was the Marketplace Fairness Act of 2015, which provided, the easiest collection of remote sales and use, where the taxation was based upon the destination of the product or the service. The same thing with the Remote Transactions Parity Act. The destination was the determining factor. So if you had someone from Virginia purchasing something from LL Bean, the fact that LL Bean is located in a no sales tax state would not be determinative. What would be determinative would be the sales tax of the jurisdiction in Virginia. That differs, however, from the Online Sales Tax Simplification Act, which is introduced by Virginian Chairman Goodlatte. Chairman Goodlatte is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over this online sales regime. It's not in the Taxing Committee. It's in the Constitutional Committee or the Judiciary Committee because of the constitutional relationships between states. The difference between what the online sales tax simplification does and the remote and the marketplace is that it applies the origin of the sale so that if a Virginia consumer makes a purchase from LL Bean, again being in a non-tax state, would pay no sales tax, and so then there would be no sales tax remitted to Virginia. Whereas on the other hand, if someone from Maine happened to purchase, New Hampshire happened to purchase peanuts, their son or daughter went to William and Mary, they fell in love with the peanut clusters that they could get in Williamsburg, and there's a huge peanut online sale catalog that comes out of Williamsburg. if they were to make that purchase under the online sales tax simplification, they would pay the tax for Williamsburg, and that money would be remitted to Maine, even though Maine does, I'm sorry, to New Hampshire, even though New Hampshire does not have a sales tax. A little bit confused, really disappointed, because Chairman Goodlatte has been seen as the stumbling block for us to be able to move the Marketplace Fairness Act. Anything that the good citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia could do to convince Chairman Goodlatte that that's not a workable idea would be greatly appreciated. Again, if anything happens in this Congress, I fear it will be the Online Sales Tax Simplification Act. That is the Goodlatte legislation, not the Marketplace Fairness Act, which was passed by the Senate in the last Congress and never even got a vote in the House. Next, please. Oh, and to come back on the Trump theme, President Trump hasn't indicated a preference one way or the other, nor has Vice President-elect Pence. At the FCC, we talked a little bit about each of these things. The big one is the mobility petition, and again, thanks to Steve Trailer, we have an extra month in which to address this crisis. But in the mobility, basically, they're asking the FCC to interpret or to clarify that 253C, which talks about wireline and access to rights of way, and provides for fair and reasonable compensation, provides for competitive, neutral, and non-discriminatory pricing, and requires that any such compensation be publicly disclosed by the local government or the local or state government. They're asking that that be extended to wireless provisions, despite the fact that Section 332C7 says that that's the only section that applies. And so this will be an interesting discourse that we're going to undertake. I think it's a little bit of an uphill slog, but it'll be even worse if we don't have a real participation, especially from Virginia, because the Fourth Circuit, which is the circuit that oversees controversies that arise out of the Commonwealth, has been very good to local governments in terms of appeals and reviews of FCC actions in light of, with respect to siting of wireless facilities. So it would be great for us to have a couple of Virginia jurisdictions to file. In case it goes wrong for us, we'd have the ability to go to the Fourth Circuit again, which has been a pretty good circuit for us in terms of being able to frame our challenges to FCC action. There's also the independent programmer notice of inquiry adopted to address the availability of diverse and independent sources of video programming. This was, in fact, Commissioner Clyburn's effort. I fear that it's going to suffer. It will be one of the real impact, not necessarily of it being a Trump administration, but of it being a GOP-controlled FCC. And so I think that this may be one of our first casualties. Next slide, please. The set-top boxes were pretty much dead with commission action stalling before the election. I think it's now totally dead. And so I don't know whether or not you can point to the death of the set-top boxes as being a Trump result, or it was severely wounded in the last administration. But it's definitely off the table now, which is terrible, since in 1996 the FCC was directed by Congress in the rewrite of the Act in '96 to create a competitive marketplace for navigational devices, and here we are, some 21 years later, and we still don't have a competitive marketplace for set-top boxes. People will continue to have to rent them from their cable operator, and I think the real shame of it is that it'll be a market incentive to drive people to over the top, and unless somehow we're able to make a strong case for over the top being subject to cable obligations and cable regulations, we could see a significant loss in both our revenues, but also in privacy rights and the idea of what channels and what services have to carry public educational and governmental channels. So again, it would be nice that consumers had the choice of a set-top box. I fear long-term that the inability to choose set-top boxes will be a market incentive or inducement for folks to look for services that don't require that monthly rental, and that in the long run, that will be a negative impact for local government as much as it is for the cable industry, which is going to get paid one way or the other. They're either going to get paid for the cable service or they're going to get paid for the provision of the landline or the broadband connection, as the case may be. The last area in the FCC is this reorg that's been talked about. I must tell you that I know nothing more than that which is in the trade press. I guess my only plea would be that we not focus on the arrangement of the deck chairs. It's the direction of the Titanic that's really more important. And I know our community will fixate on the fact that they're reorganizing the FCC and not necessarily what's happening at the FCC while they reorganize. Also, I have to tell you, from a personal standpoint, I'm not so sure that a reorganization doesn't make sense. I think one of the difficulties that we have right now is that we have virtually identical services that are being regulated dramatically different and are overseen by different bureaus just because of sort of what their history is or the technology that they're using to make, to deliver the services. So again, I'm not sure that I necessarily would oppose that idea. I also think that in the long run, if local government is going to preserve the ability to manage its rights of way and to be fairly compensated for the use of same, then it's the number of electric bits that run across the line or the revenue that's generated by those bits that is going to need to be the determining factor. It's not whether or not it's a cable service versus a telephone service versus an information service, because I think in that world, our revenues can only shrink. So again, they're not doing it for us, but there may be an opportunity for us to build our case that all those things should be treated equally. Next slide, please. Broadband privacy, we already know is probably in big trouble. It never got done, and it won't get done. So again, I think that's a casualty of the administration, of the change of administration. It's also going to be a casualty of the changing of the designation of what a broadband service is. Again, they were able to impose privacy because there was a Title II oversight. If broadband is not a Title II service or have a Title II component, then it's going to be very hard to, in fact, inflict that. I'm sorry, not inflict that, excuse me, impose a privacy obligation that's found in Title II or the broadband privacy or the cable privacy rights that are found in Title VI. So we'll have to see where all that goes. And then the Congressional Review Act would target any action by the administration that was done in the last, I think it's in the last 30 days of the administration and its legislative days, which takes us back to somewhere around the middle of July. And there's an awful lot that's happened there, and so we would have to see what happens with that. In fact, an awful lot of these late-breaking items still have to go into a Trump Office of Management and Budget to be approved under the Paperwork Reduction Act. And so we may see things overturned at the OMB, we may see things overturned at the FCC, such as net neutrality, or we may see Hill reversal, which could be net neutrality, but it could also be a number of the other items that we talked about. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to skip the first one. We talked about the HUD broadband dockets, both for new construction and consolidated plan. If you don't know about those, please find out more about those, and you can email me and I'll send you a report that we already wrote. Next slide, please. We spent a little bit of time here talking about the closed captioning certificate rules. They're not yet effective. In the earliest date, we're being told we'd have to begin filing those certifications would be July the 1st. The Media Bureau has to create a web page and have that web page for registration approved. It would have to be approved by OMB. And so whether or not anyone is going to have to register in 2017 is an open question. I think it would make sense for us to close that question to make sure that if anyone has to register, it's just be the channel and not the individual programmer. That's what the ACM waiver is all about. And again, we'll have to keep looking for opportunities to see whether or not it's really unduly burdensome to have individual channels register and demonstrate that they qualify for the exemption. And then we've got the transfer consents yet to be addressed. AT&T Time Warner, the president-elect told us all during the election that that's something that he would want to look very closely at and was not predisposed. Some of that position seems to have been softened up, but we'll have to wait and see. Next slide, please. Again, the Department of Justice will have sort of a parallel jurisdiction over two of the items that we talked about, that is the AT&T Time Warner merger, but they'll also have review as to what in fact local governments have to do with respect to closed captioning requirements beyond just PEG programming. So we know that there are specific exemptions that local governments can cite to exempt us from closed captioning under the FCC rules. The Department of Justice rules are different, and that is there has to be reasonable accommodation to ensure that folks that are either hearing impaired or are blind are able to access important government government publications or announcements or pronouncements, and that standard has not been nearly as clear. Again, the National League of Cities, with support from the TOA, did file at the DOJ, so we're not exactly sure where that's all going to come out. There were comments filed in early October. That may be something that that will change, or the standard may be loosened in the new administration, but I have nothing to point to for that assertion other than sort of the generic feeling that there'll be a reduction in regulatory burden. Again, I think the difficult issue for local government outside of the communications area is going to be how does local government take advantage of some of these efforts to deregulate, but at the same time making sure that deregulation does not become synonymous with preemption. I'll give you an example. In the EPA world, there was a rule that came out a couple of years ago called Waters of the U.S., which was by local government standpoint, a significant expansion of the type of waterway that fell under the FCC's jurisdiction. The EPA's jurisdiction. EPA had pretty broad jurisdiction under the navigable waters, which is the federal standard. But the waters of the U.S. went beyond that, and it included waters that fed into navigable waters, and that impacted local government significantly. There have been efforts to overturn that on the Hill and in the courts. It appears now that the effort, may not have to be overturned in the courts because Congress will do something. And again, that's from a local government business standpoint, that may be good news. What we need to do, though, is we need to make sure that that type of effort to deregulate does not give us the basis for preemption, which is what I think we might see in some of the telecommunications siting issues, where folks, in fact, are asking for just that. Next slide, please. And then in the courts, again, unless any of these are going up to the Supreme Court, the court composition, I think, is going to be the exact same thing as it's been at the end of the Obama administration. So I don't think that the election will have much impact at all. And on none of these do I see the Department of Justice shifting positions. So the big one for us is the TELA taking on the FCC with respect to the effective competition order. Oral argument was made in that case November the 10th. I think you can't predict times for when courts will provide their opinions, but I think we probably expect an opinion on that sometime this first quarter. Next slide, please. Again, the U.S. Telecom versus FCC, that's the net neutrality, the open internet order. I think that what we will see is that the D.C. Circuit will probably not provide review en banc, which is what's happening right now. And in the meantime, the industry will have to figure out whether or not it goes up to the Supreme Court with that, or it looks for some sort of relief at the FCC or in the Congress. Again, I suspect that the difference here is that it'll be sort of void in the not so distant future. U.S. Telecom Association versus FCC upheld the FCC's actions. All simply is going to happen there is the FCC is going to rewrite what its rules are, and we'll go from there. FTC versus AT&T. This was the case that said that the Federal Trade Commission could not oversee certain actions of AT&T because the FTC was barred from doing deceptive practices because someone was a common carrier. The FCC has exclusive jurisdiction over an entity if it's a common carrier. Again, I think what happens here is that this gets turned on its head when the underlying fact pattern, that is, whether or not an entity is a pure common carrier, goes away upon a rewrite of the law. Next slide, please. Again, City of Eugene versus Comcast, that's an Oregon Supreme Court case that upheld Eugene 7% right-of-way fee. I don't know how that, or if that is attacked in a Trump administration. The same thing with the states of Tennessee and North Carolina versus the FCC. That's the muni provisioning case. The Sixth Circuit found against the FCC, and the FCC did not take a further appeal. I think that what we'll see, and we're already seeing, for instance, in Virginia, I think we'll probably see a reintroduction of legislation in the states to limit, if not outright bar, municipal provisioning of broadband services. Next slide, please. The wireless siting order, again, this is this case was decided. It didn't go to the Supreme Court. The FCC was upheld, so that won't be going anywhere. The Sixth Circuit did review, have oral argument in early December on its order with respect to 621 video franchising. That was whether or not certain in-kind services could be offset against the franchise fee, as well as whether or not local governments had any authority over mixed-use networks, and then finally whether or not its decision applied to states where there was already state franchising in place. Our arguments were held on December the 8th. We actually, Joe Van Eaton made those arguments, and by most people's thoughts, it went pretty well. Again, I think we would expect a decision late first quarter, at the latest second quarter. Not sure that this would be impacted by the change in administration, except to say that perhaps, in fact, it would if we were successful. A GOP pie led administration might be tempted to actually take this case up, and so we would wait and see. Next slide, please. And then the last thing is that FirstNet, which is the effort to build out a nationwide broadband public safety interoperable network, is on hold right now because one of the unsuccessful bidders has challenged the bid process in the Federal Court of Claims. We're actually going to file a friend of the court brief with that Federal Court of Claims, not taking a position on the merits, but simply telling the court that the time is of the essence, that that there's a big swath of spectrum that is sitting there being unused and values being lost, and there's a fixed amount of money for FirstNet until it starts to make some money for itself. And again, time really is the enemy here. So whatever their decision is, we need them to make it. We need to make it quick so that that can move forward. That's it for sort of the hard news. Now the next slide, please. I need to thank the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. During the campaign, put out a paper which tried to compare the two organizations or the two candidates' positions. And we're going to go through a whole lot of slides because on an awful lot of them, while there was detail for the Democratic candidate, the GOP candidate, policy pronouncements in the communications area were non-existent. So next slide, please. So again, I think that the big thing is that we would see a huge push from the President-elect Trump's people to issue temporary moratorium on new agency regulations, to order agencies to catalog and eliminate any existing regulations which are not necessarily do not improve public safety or which necessarily kill jobs. And again, since the arbiter of that assessment is going to be a new team, I imagine there'd be significantly more regulations fall into that category than did before. And then the immediate cancellation of all illegal and overreaching executive orders, although I don't know that there's any that are specifically in our area. Next slide, please. So you can see with respect to wireless and spectrum, there's been no position. I think anytime it says no position, I think that it would be safe for us to assume that the House GOP position is the position that will prevail. Same thing with Title II. The President-elect expressed displeasure with the open internet order, but saw it really as another DC attack, from imposing requirements from the top down. There was one time during the campaign where he talked about the fairness doctrine and wanted to use it to target. He worried that it was being used to target conservative media. We'll have to wonder to see if it goes the other way around now. The President-elect did not appear to have ever commented on the need to update the Communications Act. So again, I think that we will probably, the default position that will by the House GOP and specifically Vice President-elect Pence, Vice President Pence was a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, specifically the Telecommunications Subcommittee, before he went back to run for governor of Indiana. So he was there in the '96 Act, and so I think he will bring to the table at least significant memories of what happened in this area. Next slide, please. Again, broadband and telecom subsidies, no position on broadband adoption and digital literacy. Next slide, please. No position on broadband competition. With respect to online sales tax, the President-elect did suggest that online retailers should collect and remit sales tax. So who knows? Unfortunately, if it's done the way that Chairman Goodlatte wants to do it, that provides really no relief for us. If it's done under the Marketplace Fairness Act, then there is significant relief. Next slide, please. And that's it. So why don't I'm there for questions and answers. I apologize if I went too long.
Jerry, you did not go too long. It's just a ton of information that tells us that we've got numerous issues going on in many different arenas. And it's going to take a while to know what really is going to be the impact, I think. I have a couple questions here, if you have a minute. Our first one is from Rick Elrod, who's on our VTOA board. Jerry, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. How do you see the Trump administration's effects on the courts over the long term? How much change can be made over the next 4 years?
I think that there can be a huge change in our courts, and that is based upon two sort of facts on the record. One, it is clear that the GOP-controlled Senate for the last number of years has been very slow to populate either the district court level or the courts of appeal with Obama nominees, or President Obama nominees. And second of all, there is the GOP has a working control of the Senate right now, and one of the things that happened the last time the Democrats were in control was they took away or created what they called the nuclear option, and that was a finding under precedent that for any position in the government other than Justice of the Supreme Court, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, which would include Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that any position other than those 9 could be confirmed with a simple majority of the Senate. And so what that means is that we have a significant gap in the court today in terms of personnel, and we have a party in place of both the White House and the Senate that's in a position to populate that. So not only fill in the gap of the pre-existing gap, but then to make what would be the normal appointments for the next 4 years, which would grow simply based upon, I'm losing the word, but there's a word that says that you lose people every year, attrition. Yeah, so simple attrition. So yeah, I see that. I think that President Trump will have the ability to reshape the federal judiciary in the image of not necessarily his image, but more of a conservative image. Yes.
So another question, Jerry. Have new versions of the Marketplace Fairness Act and other bills from the last session been introduced yet for the new session?
The only significant piece of legislation that's been introduced or reintroduced this year is the Mobile Now Act. The Mobile Now Act is the legislation that would create an incentive for federal agencies to identify and surrender back spectrum for use by the commercial sector in exchange for some of the revenue that would be generated by that new spectrum. It also has in it a whole section on wireless access to government and Indian territories. It had offensive language in it with respect to wireless access to local government property that we were able to have struck in the last Congress, the 114th Congress, when it was introduced in the 115th. That language stayed out, and we suspect that it will stay out in the Senate. I think that we need to be prepared in the House to take on an onslaught to reintroduce that negative language.
Question about local government websites. What do you think the Trump administration's attitude will be about accessibility requirements for state and local government websites?
Yeah, again, I've got no basis for saying this other than sort of the generic concept that a GOP administration would tend to be less regulatory than a Democratic administration. And so the standard there is whether or not the entity is making a reasonable accommodation. And again, I think, again, just based upon, sort of a gross generalization, the answer is less will be required to meet the standard of a reasonable accommodation.
And an apology for coming in late, but could you repeat the information on the HUD requirements, the HUD broadband docket?
Sure. So the way that the government loves to do it, just as we were entering into the Christmas holidays, the seasonal holidays, HUD came out with two final orders that would impose broadband requirements on any of our federal housing funding. So it's CDBG and home and a number of other housing programs. There are two requirements. The one is that when a government agency on an annual basis has to file something called a consolidated plan, that consolidated plan basically demonstrates that the HUD money is being invested in a manner to maximize the impact on the community, because it requires you to show how you're using not only the HUD money, but for instance, Department of Transportation money or economic development money, et cetera. So under this new consolidated plan, you have to show what you're doing to ensure that there is broadband services that are available when you invest in a property or you build a new property, that there are broadband services proximate to it, and that you have affirmatively reached out to broadband advocates to examine those opportunities. And that'll be in effect for consolidated plans filed for 2018. So that's the consolidated order. The other order is sort of what I call the in-building, that says that effective on January the 19th, for all funds except for CDBG, which are effective on April the 19th, and I might be off by a day, so don't hold me to that. If you build new property or you renovate property with 4 or more units, that property needs to have incorporated in it the ability to deliver broadband within the property. So you have to wire it internally to support broadband, or you can use a wireless alternative, but it has to be capable of providing a broadband to those 4 or more units. And they use FCC definitions for what's broadband, et cetera. So that's in place today now, pretty much. And so, as I said, if folks want to know more about it, I can send them an analysis that we did it, or you can look it up in Public CEO, which is where it's been reprinted.
Well, Jerry, that's the end of the questions from our group, and we are so grateful for you being on our webinar today and filling us in with so much information on so many different levels. I just want to take a minute again to thank NATOA for letting us use their webinar software, and also to encourage those on the call who are not NATOA members to go to our website and be a NATOA member. It's price gouging $30 a year, and our website is vatoa.us.org. Our next VTOA event is on March 23rd at 2 p.m. where we have a membership call that's going to feature Ken Philman from Colorado talking about drones and what are some of the municipal regulations that are developing around drones. Other than that, we have our annual conference. We're aiming for May 12th in Chesterfield. We hope everybody will come, and I guess that's it. Thanks again, Jerry. And